Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into the life of a man who was never supposed to survive, and yet became the face of a nation's dreams. He was born in sickness, rose on a myth, died in daylight, and somehow, even now, he's still walking beside us, in speeches, in secrets, in that eternal flame that never goes out. His name was John F. Kennedy. But history remembers something more than a name. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely love thoughtful history like this. Let me know in the comments, what country or city are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing who's traveling back in time with me, especially in the still hours of the night. Now, dim the lights. Let the noise fade. Because tonight, we're not just telling the story of a president, we're tracing the myth of a boy born in 1917 who lit a match in the darkness and left behind a flame no bullet could ever put out. He was supposed to be the golden boy, the second son of a tycoon who built his fortune like a fortress, brick by brick, until his name echoed through every corridor of American ambition. His older brother was the strong one, the chosen one. Jack was the sickly one, the pale boy who couldn't finish his breakfast, who coughed blood into linen handkerchiefs, who lived more in hospital rooms than classrooms. No one expected him to live long enough to matter. And yet, the sickly boy became a flame. But not before death came for him, again and again. Not before the shadows of weakness taught him how to walk like a king. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, into a house where silence was rare and expectations were louder than dinner prayers. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., was a man obsessed with legacy. He measured success not by love or laughter, but by the weight of your name. He was raising champions, and Jack, with his hollow bones and sleepless nights, was never supposed to be one of them. From the very beginning, his body was an enemy. At 2 years old, Jack was nearly lost to scarlet fever. His mother, Rose, remembered the nuns placing ice packs around his burning limbs and whispering prayers outside his hospital door. The family prepared for his funeral more than once during that long year, but Jack survived. Barely. Childhood was a revolving door of ailments, measles, chickenpox, mumps, and something darker, a weakness no doctor could name. His skin was often pale, his energy thin. While other children ran wild in the gardens of privilege, Jack lay in bed, turning pages of history books. Caesar, Lincoln, Churchill. Great men, he thought, were not born healthy. They were born willing. At age 10, he was sent away to a Connecticut boarding school. He lasted 3 weeks. A persistent stomachache turned into vomiting, fever, and dizziness. He returned home, emaciated, and was later transferred to Choate, a school known for discipline. There, he charmed teachers with his wit and classmates with his irreverence. But he still missed weeks of classes due to illness. His report cards carried the same refrain: bright but sickly, clever but absent. His older brother, Joe Jr., cast a long shadow. Tall, athletic, charming, and healthy. Everything Jack was not. Joe Sr. placed his presidential ambitions in his firstborn like a coin in a jukebox, expecting the music to play just the way he liked. Jack watched from the sidelines, his voice dry with envy, admiration, and something unspoken. In 1935, Jack was accepted to Princeton. It was supposed to be a fresh start, the beginning of a serious education, a stepping stone to whatever modest career Jack might carve out for himself in law or academia. But Princeton would nearly kill him. After just 2 months, Jack collapsed from gastrointestinal distress. The pain in his abdomen became unbearable. His skin turned yellow. Doctors couldn't agree on the cause. Some said colitis, others suspected something worse. He withdrew from Princeton and returned home, weighing less than 100 pounds. He spent weeks recovering, his future once again reduced to whispers and medical charts. But Jack refused to disappear. He enrolled at Harvard the following year, where the Kennedy name could open doors, but not shield him from the truth. Harvard was filled with young men who walked with a swagger Jack couldn't fake. He had to rely on wit, charm, and strategy, and he had those in abundance. Jack developed a reputation as a flirt, a prankster, and a voracious reader. He joined the Spee Club, a prestigious final club, and began to build a version of himself that looked invincible, all while his body betrayed him behind closed doors. In 1937, his health failed again. He traveled with his father and brother to Europe and became violently ill in London. More hospital stays, more pain. The doctors couldn't explain why his stomach bled or why he needed so many transfusions. His mother feared it was cancer. Yet Jack turned everything into charm. He began writing letters to friends and family that were laced with dry humor and philosophical observation. He'd joke about death as though it were an annoying roommate, but in private, he was terrified. He studied international affairs, history, and economics. He watched the rise of fascism in Europe and began to consider what role America, and he, might play in shaping the world. His senior thesis at Harvard examined British appeasement of Hitler. It would later be published as a book titled Why England Slept, earning him critical attention as a thinker, not just a Kennedy. Still, even as his mind matured, his body withered. During his postgraduate travels in 1947, this time alone, this time with purpose, Jack collapsed again in England. Doctors at the London clinic feared the worst. He was diagnosed with Addison's disease, a rare disorder of the adrenal glands. The condition was often fatal, especially in the pre-cortisone era. They gave him a year to live. Returning home by ship, Jack lay in a darkened stateroom aboard the Queen Mary, weak and trembling. His blood pressure dipped so low that the ship's captain ordered a priest aboard to administer the last rites of the Catholic Church. Jack later said he didn't remember the ceremony, just the taste of salt water and the distant sound of a bell ringing on deck. But again, he survived. This brush with death would be the first of 3 times he received last rites before becoming president. By then, Jack had grown used to it, the slow encroachment of death, like an old friend who just wanted one more conversation. Years earlier, in 1940, with World War II looming, Jack had tried to join the army. He failed the physical. His bad back and intestinal problems disqualified him immediately. The Navy rejected him too. He was, by all accounts, too frail to serve. But Joe Sr. intervened. Through backdoor channels and quiet favors, Jack was given a commission in the Navy, not out of strength, but of access. This detail would be buried in the decades to come. Americans would later remember the war hero, not the fragile boy who couldn't pass the exam. But what made Jack Kennedy extraordinary was never his body. It was his defiance of it. As a child, he was told he would never grow strong. As a teen, he was told he would never finish school. As a young man, he was told he would not survive the year. And each time, he returned, thinner, slower, but sharper. Like a blade that learns to cut more cleanly the more it breaks. He studied the great men of history not to emulate their strength, but to understand their weakness. Caesar's epilepsy, Lincoln's melancholy, Churchill's depression. Jack knew from a young age the world only remembers the victories, but it is the pain that teaches you how to win them. In the years ahead, he would become America's most photogenic president. Bronzed smile, wind-swept hair, a portrait of youth, and vitality. But the truth was far stranger. He was held together by leather back braces, shots of adrenaline, and private rituals of endurance. He had already faced the end 3 times and lived. Jack Kennedy wasn't supposed to last, but maybe that's why he did, because he had nothing to lose but his myth, and that myth had only just begun. History tends to sculpt its heroes from marble, but sometimes they're carved from smoke, from things you can't quite hold, can't fully explain. In 1939, John F. Kennedy stood on the edge of the world he'd studied in books and debated in dorm rooms. Europe was about to go up in flames. Jack, ever frail but restless, stared across the Atlantic not as a soldier yet, but as a student of war. And fate was about to find him unprepared, unwanted, and entirely unforgettable. The Navy didn't want him. He failed the physical exam. The same weak back, the same digestive disorders, the same long-standing suspicion from doctors. This young man, whatever his name or pedigree, was not built for war. The Army passed too. The rejection letter may as well have read, "Unfit for duty, fit only for history books." But Jack Kennedy had a father, and Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. still believed that what couldn't be earned could be arranged. Within months, Jack wore a Navy uniform. On paper, he was an officer. In truth, he was still a boy wearing armor far too large, trying to outrun the body he'd been born into. Before he ever stepped onto a warship, though, Jack did something unexpected. He wrote. At 22, he published his senior thesis from Harvard under the title Why England Slept. It was a calm, measured, chilling critique of British appeasement policies in the face of Hitler's rise. Unlike most political pamphlets of the time, it did not scream or scold. It reasoned. It sounded like a man twice his age and 10 times his experience. The book earned praise from thinkers and politicians alike. To those paying attention, it marked Jack Kennedy as a man to watch. But war does not reward thought. It demands flesh. And so, when Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Jack, now formally accepted into the Navy thanks to his father's connections, sought a more active role. He didn't want to push papers in Washington. He asked to be sent to the Pacific. The Kennedy name made things happen. In early 1943, he was given command of PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat stationed in the Solomon Islands. It was small, fast, and made of plywood. It was also extremely vulnerable. On the night of August 1st, 1943, Jack's boat was on patrol in Blackett Strait. The waters were dark, the moon gone, and the air thick with the static tension of unseen enemies. Suddenly, from out of the night, a Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, loomed like a ghost ship. The impact came before they even saw it. PT-109 was sliced in half. 2 crewmen were killed instantly. The rest, including Kennedy, were thrown into the burning sea. Dazed and injured, his chronic back now seared with new pain, Jack gathered the survivors in the water. For hours, they clung to floating debris. Then came the decision. There would be no rescue unless they found help. He ordered his crew to swim, miles in the open sea, to a nearby island. One of his men, Patrick McMahon, was badly burned and couldn't swim. Jack tied a strap from McMahon's life vest between his teeth and swam, dragging him through the water. He swam for 5 hours, powered by rage, pain, and pure will. Over the next several days, Jack led his crew across small islands, avoiding Japanese patrols, rationing coconuts and rainwater, drawing plans in the sand. Finally, he carved a message into a coconut shell. Naro ISL Commander, native knows posit, he can pilot. 11 alive need, small boat, Kennedy. That coconut would save their lives. It was delivered to Allied forces by 2 native islanders working with the Coast Watchers, a secret network aiding the Americans. Soon after, a Navy rescue boat arrived. Jack and his crew were saved. The Navy awarded him the Purple Heart for injuries sustained in the collision, and the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for Valor. The press back home got wind of the story. A Kennedy had survived against all odds. Newspapers plastered his face alongside the coconut message, now encased in a glass trophy. The family smiled. The myth had begun. But Jack never smiled easily about it. He never called himself a hero. "It was involuntary," he once quipped. "They sank my boat." The truth was more complicated. Jack had misjudged that night patrol. Some whispered the PT boat should have seen the destroyer. But Jack bore the weight of command in silence. His back would never recover from the swim. He'd undergo more surgeries in years to come, often barely able to walk without help. Still, he wore the scars like armor. Then came the phone call. Joe Jr. was dead. In August 1944, while flying a top-secret mission over Nazi-occupied France, Jack's older brother, the Golden Son, the chosen heir, was killed when his experimental bomber exploded mid-air. There were no remains. Joe Sr. wept in private. Then, in public, he turned to Jack. The torch passed not through ceremony, but tragedy. Jack returned to civilian life quietly. He walked with a limp. He kept painkillers in his jacket. His mind turned back to politics, to the world he'd once observed from hospital beds and ships. He went to work for the Hearst newspapers, covering the formation of the United Nations in San Francisco and the early reconstruction of war-torn Europe. His columns revealed the same sharp instincts that had shaped his earlier writings. But he was no longer a boy writing from books. He had seen the fire, the blood, the final breath of young men who never made it back. In France, he stood among the ruins of villages. In Germany, he toured the death camps. In Poland, he watched people walk the streets with a hollow silence he would never forget. The world had changed, and so had Jack. He had survived war not by strength, but by relentlessness. The Navy didn't want him, but war made him a hero. Or maybe, a legend with a secret price. That price was now written across his body, his gait, his spine. But the real cost was invisible. He had watched his brother die in flames. He had dragged his crew through salt and shadow. He had nearly drowned in fire more than once. And he had come home not just to live, but to lead. The sickly boy was gone. In his place stood something new, something burning, something no one could yet name. But soon, the world would. John F. Kennedy, veteran, writer, survivor, was about to become the most unlikely candidate for greatness the country had ever seen. And he would wear the myth like a mask, while the truth and the pain stayed hidden just beneath the skin. They said he looked like a movie star. Young, confident, perfect smile. The golden sun America hadn't known it was waiting for. But behind the smiles, there were pills. Behind the fame, a ghostwriter. Behind the victories, pain no one saw. By 1946, Jack Kennedy was barely out of the Navy, barely recovered from the scars of war, barely holding himself upright some days. But he was being groomed, not for survival, but for destiny. Joe Sr. wasted no time. His oldest son was gone, and his ambitions had not died with him. The next, Kennedy had to rise. Jack was convinced, reluctantly at first, to run for Congress. The seat was Massachusetts' 11th district, and the Kennedy machine was already warming up. Money, influence, name recognition, it all swirled into motion like a hurricane behind a boy still wincing every time he bent his back. The public saw youth and promise. His campaign posters bore that clean, serious face, the wounded war hero who turned to service. Behind closed doors, Jack lay flat between events, wrapped in heat packs and back braces, fed a cocktail of medications just to stand behind a podium. He won easily. At 29 years old, John F. Kennedy became a congressman. But more than that, he became a product. He understood performance instinctively. From childhood, he'd learned how to hide illness behind wit, how to make people laugh before they asked hard questions. In Washington, he kept smiling. He dressed impeccably, moved carefully, shook hands firmly, even when his spine screamed. Reporters loved him. Women adored him. Colleagues underestimated him. But the truth was, Jack Kennedy was living in pain. His back was deteriorating. His adrenal glands barely worked. By the early 1950s, he was injecting himself with steroids, stimulants, and painkillers, often under the supervision of unorthodox private physicians. One doctor, Max Jacobson, later nicknamed Dr. Feelgood, regularly administered amphetamines laced with steroids to Jack. These injections allowed him to power through public appearances with energy he didn't actually have. The American people saw vitality, but inside, he was barely hanging on. And yet, he climbed higher. In 1952, after 6 years in the House, he challenged Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. for his Massachusetts Senate seat. It was a bold move. Lodge was popular and entrenched, but the Kennedy campaign was relentless. His mother, sisters, and even Jackie, then his fiancée, canvassed the state. His war record was invoked like gospel. His speeches were crisp, charming, tinged with the grace of someone who'd already seen death. And behind it all was Joe Sr., pulling strings, greasing wheels, and making sure the sun rose. Jack won, narrowly, but it was enough. At 35, he entered the Senate, and just a few months later, his body failed again. By 1954, his back had become unmanageable. He couldn't walk without assistance. The pain was so severe that he often had to be carried from bed to bath. Doctors proposed a risky spinal fusion surgery. There was a chance it could help. There was also a chance it could kill him. He chose to proceed. After the operation, things went wrong. He developed a high fever. His incision became infected. His body, weakened by years of illness, medication, and adrenal insufficiency, began to shut down. He slipped into a coma. Once again, the last rites were administered. For the second time, a priest stood over his pale body and prepared his soul for death. But again, he came back, slowly, painfully. A second operation was performed to correct the first. His recovery took months. He spent most of that year in a hospital bed, reading, dictating letters, and re-evaluating his public life. And he kept something close, a notebook full of reflections on courage. Out of that period emerged the book that would secure his intellectual image, Profiles in Courage. Published in 1956, the book told the stories of 8 U.S. senators who had risked their careers to stand by their principles. It was elegant, patriotic, and poignant. It struck a chord with readers. It also won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1957. But there was a secret. While the book bore Jack's name, much of the research and writing had been conducted by his loyal aide, Theodore Sorensen. The extent of Sorensen's contribution became a matter of speculation for decades. Some called it ghostwriting, others called it collaboration. Jack never fully addressed it. Publicly, he was now a war hero, a senator, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Privately, he still couldn't bend over without wincing. He wore a stiff back brace under every tailored suit. His aides knew to keep speeches short. Photographers learned to capture him from flattering angles. But he was also, quietly, generous. In Congress and later in the White House, Jack continued a practice he had begun early in his political career. He donated his entire salary to charity. His family's wealth made it possible, but his humility made it remarkable. It was never advertised. He never boasted about it. It simply continued. The image of Kennedy, young, brilliant, elegant, began to take hold in the American consciousness during this period. But it was just that, an image, carefully curated, tenderly protected, the golden mask. He posed for photographs with Jackie on the Capitol steps. He grinned beside colleagues. He visited veterans' hospitals. He played touch football with nephews on the lawn. But every move, every handshake, every step required discipline and pharmaceutical help. His Senate career wasn't without substance. He focused on labor, foreign policy, and rebuilding the Democratic coalition. But even then, the goal was higher. The presidency wasn't just a fantasy. It was the trajectory his family expected, and that he now began to believe in. But belief didn't ease the pain. In his Senate office, there were days when he couldn't sit at his desk. He worked lying flat on a special table. His staff adjusted. His wife adjusted. America never knew. He was still taking steroids, still relying on amphetamines, still wearing the brace, still reading the morning paper through a fog of pills. But he showed up, again and again. The golden mask held. He wasn't just surviving now, he was preparing for a stage larger than any his father had dreamed, preparing for a campaign that would change history, preparing to become the president that no one, not even himself, thought his broken body could withstand. And all the while, the myth grew. The handsome senator, the war hero, the intellectual, the philanthropist, the future. But if anyone had peeled back the layers, they would have seen it. A spine held together by pins, a bloodstream racing with chemicals, a man who'd been given last rites more than once. And yet, he smiled, because the nation didn't need to see the pain. It only needed to see the prince. And the prince was learning how to wear the crown, even if it crushed him. He lit one last cigar, then tried to burn a bridge to Cuba. But shadows have long memories. By the early 1950s, John F. Kennedy had learned how to endure pain with a grin. But the next chapter of his life would teach him how to disguise ambition with poetry. In September 1953, Jack Kennedy married Jacqueline Bouvier. To the public, it was a fairy tale. A handsome senator, tall and slender, with war medals and a Pulitzer. A graceful, intelligent debutante, fluent in French, curious about literature, art, and power. Together, they looked like a dynasty in bloom. But Jack's body was failing again. On their honeymoon in Acapulco, he was in so much pain he had to lie flat on his back for hours. Jackie, barely 24, wrote letters to her friends describing the heat and sunlight, but also the tension, the long silences, the doctors. They returned to Washington, and a new mask was forged. Not just the golden boy, but the golden couple. The young senator and his elegant wife became a brand. Magazines devoured their photos. Columnists praised their sophistication. But behind the white smiles and glittering gowns, something else was building. Tragedy. Again. In August 1956, Jackie gave birth to a stillborn daughter. They had planned to name her Arabella. The pregnancy had been complicated. Jackie was in her third trimester when she felt something was wrong. The baby arrived prematurely, silent. They never spoke of it publicly. There were no interviews, no press statements, no gravesite at the time. Jackie was devastated. Jack, though outwardly composed, disappeared into work. behind closed doors, they grieved separately. That same year, Jack nearly became vice president. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, party bosses whispered his name as Adlai Stevenson's running mate. But the Kennedys were divided. Joe Sr. was in favor. Jack hesitated. He wanted the top spot, not second place. He declined. Publicly, it was presented as a noble decision. Privately, Jack had calculated that the 1956 ticket would lose, and that 1960 would be his moment. So, he began building. He traveled relentlessly. To Iowa, to California, to the South. He made speeches in dusty halls and whispered deals in smoke-filled rooms. He built friendships with Catholic leaders, labor unions, black clergy. He raised money. He raised eyebrows. And all the while, his body rebelled. Addison's disease, a rare adrenal disorder, left him reliant on daily corticosteroid treatments. Without them, he risked collapse. With them, he risked infections, insomnia, and mood swings. His medical records were altered, diagnoses erased, symptoms renamed. Reporters were misled. Family physicians were coached on what to say and what not to. The public never knew. In campaign stops, Jack bounded on stage as if his spine were steel. In truth, he wore a stiff back brace under every suit. Between stops, he lay down in the back seat of cars. He popped pills to stay alert. And he smiled. Jackie became an icon, but not a partner in politics. She hated the campaign trail, the forced smiles, the long handshakes, the suffocating press. She retreated from the spotlight and focused on the home. But she had a rare talent Jack lacked: aesthetic control. When she spoke, people listened. When she dressed, people noticed. When she stayed home, it was seen as mystery, not absence. In the summer of 1960, the Democratic Convention crowned Jack the nominee. He was 43 years old, the youngest major party nominee for president in American history. His opponent, Richard Nixon. Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower. Smart, seasoned, ruthless. But Jack had something Nixon didn't: television. The first ever televised presidential debate was scheduled for September 26, 1960. In the weeks leading up to it, Jack prepared like a soldier. He practiced tone, posture, rhythm. He worked with media advisors to perfect his appearance, choosing a suit that contrasted just enough with the studio backdrop. He shaved an hour before the show to keep 5 o'clock shadow at bay. Nixon, recovering from illness and injured from a recent campaign stop, looked pale and tired. He refused makeup. He slouched. He sweated. The difference was immediate. Viewers who listened to the debate on the radio said Nixon had won on substance. Those who watched it on TV said Kennedy had triumphed, overwhelmingly. Image had become reality. The debates changed American politics forever, and they lifted Jack from underdog to equal footing. The race was tight. Nixon attacked his inexperience. Jack emphasized vigor, vision, and youth. His speeches invoked the frontier spirit, the dreams of the New Deal, and a new generation of leadership. But there was another factor: religion. Jack was Catholic, the first Catholic nominated since Al Smith in 1928, and that had ended in a crushing defeat. Anti-Catholic sentiment still ran deep in America. Protestant ministers warned that a Kennedy presidency meant papal control over the White House. Jack confronted it directly. In a speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, he declared, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate, who happens also to be a Catholic." The speech, clear and forceful, won over skeptics. It became a defining moment of the campaign. Election Day arrived, November 8, 1960. The vote was razor thin. Kennedy won by just over 100,000 votes nationwide, one of the closest elections in American history. But in the Electoral College, the vote that truly mattered, he triumphed. 303 to Nixon's 219. He would be the 35th President of the United States. Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1961. Jackie stood beside him, elegant and unreadable. Snow covered the Capitol steps. A nation watched as a man barely out of war, barely out of illness, and barely older than most governors, raised his hand and swore the oath. He spoke words that would echo across time. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The myth was now a reality, but not everything was as pure as the snow that day. Just days before the inauguration, Kennedy had quietly ordered his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, to secure a large stash of Cuban cigars. Salinger returned with 200 Petit Upmanns, Jack's favorite. The next morning, Jack signed the executive order imposing a full trade embargo against Cuba. He'd lit one last cigar before shutting the door. And somewhere in the haze of that act, indulgence before policy, lay the tension that would define his presidency. Charm masking danger, pleasure masking consequence. The seeds of crisis had already been planted, but for now, America smiled. A new age had begun, and the prince, still in pain, still injecting himself with steroids, still wearing a brace beneath his tailored coats, had become the king. Camelot was here, but so was the curse. The man with the codes to end the world was also dreaming of secret agents, cigars, and peace missions. Which version of Kennedy would survive? The cold settled over Washington like a crown of frost. January 20th, 1961. Jack Kennedy stood before the nation, hand raised, voice firm, snow swirling like prophecy. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And with that, the myth turned flesh. The youngest elected president in American history had arrived, with the poise of a prince and the fire of a reformer. A boy whose body had nearly failed him time and time again now held the nuclear codes. The Kennedy era, Camelot, had officially begun. He was 43. He was charming. He was wounded. He was a contradiction incarnate, and the world watched. But beneath the optimism, the speeches, the gleaming smiles, a storm had already begun to gather. Within days of taking office, Kennedy proposed a new initiative, an idea born of idealism, patriotism, and global empathy. The Peace Corps. It would send young Americans abroad, not with guns or orders, but with books, tools, medicine, and open hands. Volunteers would teach, build, assist. They would represent a new kind of American power, not domination, but presence. Not empire, but engagement. Some mocked it, others feared it. But Kennedy saw something deeper, a chance to redefine patriotism, to inspire youth not toward war, but service. It passed. Thousands volunteered, and a signal went out to the world. America was trying something different, but not everything was idealistic. In April 1961, only 3 months into his presidency, Kennedy faced his first disaster: the Bay of Pigs. The CIA had drawn up plans under Eisenhower's administration to arm and train Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro. Jack inherited the blueprint. His generals advised it was sound. His intelligence chiefs assured him the invasion would be swift and successful. It wasn't. On April 17th, over 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at Playa Girón. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and exposed. No American air cover arrived. Locals did not rise in rebellion. Castro's forces crushed them in 3 days. Over 100 men were killed, the rest captured. The world saw Kennedy humiliated. He had trusted the CIA, trusted the Cold War instincts of the bureaucracy. And now he paid the price. Publicly, he accepted full responsibility. Privately, he was livid. He began to distrust the very agencies meant to protect him. The CIA, that fortress of secrets, suddenly looked fallible. Their optimism had masked recklessness. Their plans were fantasies. Kennedy's brother, Bobby, became his closest confidant, not generals or spies. And Kennedy began to change. He began to think more critically, question more fiercely. He no longer assumed that his advisors had better instincts than he did. He grew cautious, analytical, and above all, deeply aware that one mistake could end the world. That awareness would come to define him in 1962. October. A U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba snapped photographs that would shake the planet. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, had secretly installed medium-range nuclear missiles just 90 miles from American shores, capable of reaching Washington in minutes. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. For 13 days, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. Kennedy convened a secret group of advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or ExComm. Hawks urged immediate airstrikes. Some demanded full invasion. Kennedy hesitated. He remembered the Bay of Pigs. He knew how miscalculation could spiral. He listened. He waited. He paced. And then, he chose a blockade. Officially termed a quarantine, the U.S. Navy surrounded Cuba, preventing Soviet ships from delivering more weapons. It was a high-stakes gamble. The world held its breath. Khrushchev responded with fury, but also uncertainty. Then came a letter from Moscow, pleading for peace. Then a second letter, more aggressive, more demanding. Kennedy responded to the first. He offered to remove American missiles from Turkey, privately, in exchange for the dismantling of the Soviet sites in Cuba. Khrushchev agreed. The crisis ended, not with mushroom clouds, but with paper, patience, and poise. Kennedy was hailed as a hero, but he knew better. He had seen how close the abyss truly was. He had stared into midnight and stepped back. Afterwards, he became more determined to reduce the threat of nuclear war, more skeptical of generals who measured victory in megatons, more passionate about diplomacy. But even in the midst of all this, he was still Jack, the man who met quietly and gleefully with Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. They shared drinks, talked spycraft, laughed about villains and secret weapons. Kennedy admired Bond, the charisma, the nerve, the adventure. He once told friends that From Russia with Love was one of his favorite novels. But unlike Bond, Kennedy didn't have a license to kill. He had something far heavier, the power to choose who might live. In 1962, he began installing a secret recording system in the White House. Oval Office, cabinet room. Microphones were discreetly embedded. Cables ran to a reel-to-reel recorder in the basement. Why? Kennedy wanted an archive. He wanted history to remember the nuance, the context, the deliberations. Some say it was for future memoirs. Others suggest he didn't trust anyone and wanted proof of what was said behind closed doors. The tapes would eventually become one of the greatest historical records of any presidency. But no one knew it then. Not the press, not the public, not even some of his aides. Just Jack, watching, listening, recording history while he made it. And still, his body betrayed him. He took regular injections to stay functional. The back brace was ever present. He could barely lift his son, John Jr., without wincing. But to the world, he was vitality incarnate. He was the boy who'd become the flame, flickering, dangerous, mesmerizing. And the flame had only just begun to burn. He wanted peace with Russia. He wanted Johnson gone. He feared one Republican more than the rest. And someone wanted him stopped. 1963 was the year the storm began to whisper louder than the song. Jack Kennedy had survived the Bay of Pigs. He had danced on the edge of nuclear fire and stepped back. He had electrified the world with his youth, his vision, his words. But now, in the third year of his presidency, his enemies were multiplying, and some were not strangers. He no longer trusted his own corridors. That spring, he issued a document. Dry, technical, bureaucratic. NSAM 263, National Security Action Memorandum. Buried in the jargon was a bombshell, a directive for the withdrawal of 1,000 American military personnel from Vietnam by the end of the year. Kennedy, once a cold warrior, had begun to doubt the domino theory. He saw the trap, the jungle, the illusion, the whispers in the Pentagon promising easy victory. He remembered Cuba. He remembered almost dying for nothing. So he began to shift. He didn't announce it from a podium. There were no fanfares, just a signal embedded in policy: pull back. He told aides privately he did not want a full-scale American war in Southeast Asia. Let the Vietnamese fight their war. Not everyone agreed. Some saw it as weakness, others betrayal. Inside the intelligence community, cold shoulders became silent war. The CIA had never forgiven him for the Bay of Pigs humiliation, and now he was undermining their strategy in Indochina. His anger with the agency only grew. He famously remarked he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He did not hide his contempt, and the CIA, in turn, stopped hiding their doubt. Elsewhere in Washington, another Cold War brewed, this one domestic. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, had grown wary. Hoover had files. Hoover always had files. He knew about Jack's affairs. He knew who came and went from the back doors of the White House. But more than that, Hoover resented the Kennedy brothers' influence. Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, had challenged Hoover's power, especially on civil rights. Hoover wanted surveillance, intimidation, control. Bobby wanted action. Jack tried to balance it all, but he knew the two men hated each other. Jack had made powerful enemies. Some wore uniforms, some wore badges, some wore suits without names, and yet he still dreamed. In September 1963, he stood before the United Nations and delivered a speech that stunned even his closest advisors. He proposed a joint US-Soviet mission to the moon. Why, he asked, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? The Soviets blinked. His own NASA officials panicked. This was the man who had once declared America must land on the moon first, who had poured billions into the space race. Now he was reaching across the Iron Curtain, not just for peace on Earth, but beyond. It was idealism at its most ambitious, and danger at its most subtle. Some in his circle warned against it. They said the Soviets would never agree. They said it would show weakness. But Jack didn't flinch. He believed that war was no longer survivable. The future had to be different. Back home, the civil rights movement surged. Birmingham, Mississippi, marches, boycotts, bombs. Kennedy had been cautious at first, fearing to alienate Southern Democrats. But now, the urgency overwhelmed the politics. His secret White House tapes recorded the rawness, shouting behind closed doors, advisors begging him to slow down, others pleading to move faster. Jack listened. Jack paced. Then he moved. In June, he gave a televised address that cracked through the apathy. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. He proposed sweeping civil rights legislation, equal access, desegregation, federal enforcement. He had crossed another line. The South erupted. Death threats poured in. But Kennedy, for once, did not look back. And still, the taping system hummed beneath the floorboards. It captured the dissonance, the weight, the private sorrow that no speech revealed. One can hear Jack sigh, hear him laugh, then fall silent, hear the burden. In the background, the 1964 campaign loomed. Jack planned to run again. But there were whispers in the halls. Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, was seen by many as baggage. The southern base he once secured had become a liability. Jack wondered aloud to aides, should I replace him? Names floated: George Smathers, Terry Sanford. Even Evelyn Lincoln, his loyal secretary, would later write that Jack told her, just 3 days before Dallas, that Johnson might not be on the ticket. The knives came out. Hoover, a friend of Johnson's, bristled. Southern Democrats seethed. Rumors spun in the dark. And on the Republican side, another surprise. George Romney, governor of Michigan, moderate, telegenic, clean reputation. A Mormon, yes, but charismatic, self-made, hard to label. Jack told a friend in 1963, "The one fellow I don't want to run against is Romney. That guy could be tough." He didn't fear Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was too far right. But Romney might unify the middle. It unsettled him. And then, Dallas drew near. Texas was key. It had been drifting. Jack needed to show unity. He needed to show Johnson still mattered. So he planned the trip. Fly to Texas, ride with Lyndon, charm the cities, show the Kennedy magic. But there were ghosts in the corridors, people he no longer trusted, agencies that bristled under his rule, a nation fracturing by race, ideology, and fear. He wanted peace with Russia. He wanted Johnson gone. He feared Romney more than Goldwater. And someone, maybe many someones, wanted him stopped. The motorcade route was finalized. The shadows gathered, and November waited, silent and watching. The president's last words weren't to a crowd. They were to Jackie, about lunch. November 22, 1963. The day began with sunshine. Dallas shimmered beneath a cloudless sky, the wind sharp but not biting, the air clearer than prophecy. The presidential motorcade was scheduled to move through downtown just after noon. Crowds were already gathering, some with banners, some with doubts. Jack and Jackie had flown in from Fort Worth that morning. The president had delivered a speech there. Off the cuff, warm, relaxed. He joked about not wearing a hat. People loved him for it. He was young, charming, full of ease. Jackie Kennedy wore a pink Chanel suit, the color of cherry blossoms and innocence. It was her husband's idea. He'd told her, "Let them see you. They love you." In private, she didn't want to come. Texas was hostile. Protesters had been brutal in other cities. Vice President Johnson's presence made things more complicated, but she agreed. She always did, in the end. Jack had spent the morning in a good mood. He was excited to be seen. He liked the energy. This was the campaign before the campaign. 1964 loomed, and Texas needed warming. Air Force One landed at Love Field just before 11:40 a.m. The Kennedys descended the stairs hand in hand, the pink suit flashing like a target against the crowd. Photographers clicked, fans cheered, bouquets were handed over. Jackie accepted them with practiced grace. Then, the limousine. It was a Lincoln Continental, midnight blue, with the top down. The motorcade was to proceed through the city, down Main Street, past Dealey Plaza, before reaching the Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to speak over lunch. In the car, President Kennedy, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, Texas Governor John Connally, his wife Nellie. The driver, Secret Service agent William Greer. Another agent, Roy Kellerman, sat up front. Jack sat behind the driver, Jackie to his left, Connally in front of Jack, Nellie in front of Jackie. There was no bubble top. At 11:50 a.m., they began. Crowds lined the streets, children waved, office workers leaned from windows, flags flapped. At every stoplight, Jack smiled and waved. Jackie nodded, immaculate. As they turned onto Main Street, Nellie Connally leaned back and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Jack smiled, and then he turned to Jackie. "We're headed to the Trade Mart for lunch." Those were his last known words. 12:30 p.m. Central Time. The motorcade turned onto Houston Street. The crowds thickened as they neared Dealey Plaza, a triangle of grass, concrete, and layered time. Then the turn onto Elm Street, sharp, slow. And then it happened. A sharp crack. Confusion. Then another. Then a third. Jack's head snapped forward, then back. Jackie turned, not in fear, but confusion. She saw her husband's face contort. She leaned toward him. Blood. The first bullet had struck his upper back, exiting through his throat. He tried to speak, but couldn't. The back brace, worn to support his fragile spine, kept him upright. It made him a perfect target for the second shot, the fatal shot. It shattered his skull. Part of it flew onto the trunk of the car. Jackie reached out, not understanding. She scrambled onto the trunk, trying to retrieve what was gone. Secret Service agent Clint Hill leapt onto the back of the car, pushing her back inside. The limousine accelerated. In the front seat, Kellerman shouted to the driver, "Let's get out of here. We're hit." Jack slumped into Jackie's lap, eyes open, lifeless. She whispered to him, held him. The pink suit, now blood red. The motorcade sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Doctors rushed to the emergency room. But it was too late. The president had arrived without a pulse. At 1:00 p.m., John Fitzgerald Kennedy was declared dead. Age 46. Across town, Lyndon Johnson was ushered into Air Force One. The mood was grim, electric, unreal. Bobby Kennedy had been notified by phone. His voice broke. Jackie insisted on riding with the body. She refused to change her clothes. When a nurse offered her a fresh dress, she declined. "No, I want them to see what they've done." They brought in a coffin, a bronze casket. Secret Service agents carried it onto the plane. And there, aboard Air Force One, in a cramped conference cabin, Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office. Judge Sarah Hughes read the words. Jackie stood beside him, holding Jack's hand, now stiff, now silent, just outside the frame. Her suit still soaked. A photographer captured the moment. LBJ, hand raised. Jackie, in profile, dazed, blood on her wrist. America between breaths. The plane took off. History split. The world that returned to Washington was not the one that had left it that morning. In Dealey Plaza, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested less than 90 minutes after the assassination, first for the murder of a Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippit, then charged later that night with the murder of the president. He denied it. "I'm just a patsy," he said. He never stood trial. 2 days later, Oswald was shot on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. And so the story sealed itself. No confession, no trial, only echoes. And the pink suit. The autopsy was botched, hurried, interfered with by military officials. The body was transported hastily. The wounds debated endlessly. Photographs vanished. Witnesses changed stories. For decades, millions would argue. One shooter? Two? A conspiracy? But what's certain is this. On that day, time stopped. Children remember where they were. Parents remember the silence. Teachers wept in classrooms. Men cried on construction sites. Radios stopped playing music. Television anchors fought tears. The world had lost something more than a president. It had lost its balance. Camelot had shattered. Jack Kennedy, the boy who became the flame, had been extinguished in an instant, and the image of his wife, holding his body, refusing to let go, refusing to clean the blood, became the new American flag. A flag of mourning. His enemies outlived him. His secrets were locked away, and his children buried beside him. A dynasty cracked before it ruled. The blood had not yet dried when the curtain of silence began to fall. 2 days after Kennedy's death, the nation watched as Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin, was paraded through the basement of the Dallas police station. Reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs exploded, and then, a blur. Jack Ruby stepped forward and pulled the trigger. Oswald collapsed, gasping, the same way Jack had. In front of millions watching live television, the last man who might have answered the world's questions was gone. And so began the age of shadows. Ruby claimed he did it out of grief, to spare Jackie the pain of a trial. But the stories tangled. Ruby had mafia ties. He knew police officers by name. He moved with a familiarity that should have raised alarms. But the story hardened. Warren Commission was formed, a blue-ribbon panel of elites and experts handpicked by President Johnson, tasked with investigating the assassination. They examined the Zapruder film, a silent, grainy reel that captured the death in 26.6 seconds. They reviewed ballistics, testimonies, autopsy reports, Oswald's background, and in September 1964, they concluded Oswald acted alone. No conspiracy, no foreign power, no domestic enemies. One man, 3 bullets. Case closed. But it didn't feel closed. Not to the public, not to historians, not to Bobby Kennedy. Within days of the report's release, cracks formed. Witnesses claimed they were misquoted. Others said they were pressured to change their stories. The bullet trajectory, the infamous magic bullet that supposedly hit both Kennedy and Connolly, strained the limits of logic. The autopsy photos didn't match the official report. The FBI had been watching Oswald well before the shooting, even knowing of his return from the Soviet Union, his radical affiliations, and his strange behavior. Why was he not intercepted? Hoover had answers, but he kept them buried. As years passed, declassified memos revealed the depth of surveillance, not just of Oswald, but of Kennedy himself. The FBI had tapped the phones of civil rights leaders, of foreign diplomats, of suspected dissidents. Hoover's bureau had files on the Kennedy family's private lives, political strategies, and secret affairs. And then there were the tapes. In the summer of 1962, President Kennedy had installed a secret taping system in the White House. Not for paranoia, not at first. He claimed it was to record history, to capture decisions as they happened, to aid his memoirs perhaps, but it became something else, a vault of vulnerability. The tapes captured high-level strategy, arguments about Cuba and Vietnam, civil rights clashes, secrets no public would have accepted. For years after his death, they remained sealed. Only decades later would Americans hear the real voices, the hesitations, the doubts, the jokes, and the cracks. Meanwhile, the world kept turning. Lyndon Johnson, sworn in aboard Air Force One, escalated the war in Vietnam. What had begun as an advisory mission became a quagmire. By 1968, 500,000 American troops were deployed. The jungle soaked up lives. Many asked, would Jack have done the same? Bobby thought not. He stepped forward in 1968, declaring his candidacy for president, not just as a legacy of his brother, but as a force of his own. He spoke of poverty, justice, war, and reconciliation. Crowds gathered. Tears flowed at his rallies. It was as if Jack had returned. And then, again, the bullet. June 5, 1968. Bobby Kennedy shot in Los Angeles. Another Kennedy felled in public. Another myth sealed in blood. The family gathered again, this time with deeper wrinkles, heavier eyes. Jackie grieved from afar. She could not bear the repetition. But she had her children, Caroline and John Jr., and the lost ones. In 1956, Jackie gave birth to a stillborn daughter, whom they named Arabella. In August 1963, just months before Dallas, their son Patrick was born 5 weeks premature. He died 2 days later from a lung disease. Jack had cried in private. Jackie had not spoken for days. After the assassination, the remains of both children were moved to Arlington National Cemetery. They were buried beside their father, beneath the eternal flame. A family reassembled in death. 3 graves, a broken cradle. The tapes, the secrets, the suspicions. They lingered. Books emerged. Films. Panels. More commissions. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that there was likely a conspiracy, that a second gunman may have been involved, but no names, no arrests, just echoes. The puppet strings had been cut, but not all were visible. Jack Kennedy's image remained frozen in youth. Forever. 46, smiling, waving, but beneath that image was a vault of pain, of lies, of half-told truths. The nation never fully recovered, because Camelot, as his wife would later say, was not just a myth. It was a memory too fragile for the weight of reality. And yet, it endures, not because it was perfect, but because it dared to dream. Some people die, others are taken. But a myth walks forever. July 16, 1999. The Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, was a sea of night. In the cockpit of a small Piper Saratoga plane, John F. Kennedy Jr. was flying low. With him were his wife, Carolyn Bessette, and her sister Lauren. They never made it to the wedding they were headed for. Sometime around 9:40 p.m., the plane disappeared from radar. No distress signal, no calls. Just a silence, too familiar. For 5 days, the nation held its breath. Then the Coast Guard found the wreckage. All 3 were dead. The final son of Camelot, the boy who once saluted his father's casket at age 3, was gone. And with him, the last thread of that fragile, tragic dynasty. The myth didn't die that night, but something final was sealed. John Jr. had lived under a shadow from the moment he was born. Newspapers called him America's Prince. His face was on magazines before he could read. He carried a name heavier than most men could bear, and for a time he wore it with grace. He studied law, founded a political magazine, George, a glossy attempt to merge politics and pop culture. He was charismatic, awkwardly elegant, and quietly searching. Many thought he'd run for office. Some thought the presidency. But if he was ever meant to reclaim his father's legacy, the ocean took that chance away. And now, with Caroline the sole survivor of JFK's immediate family, the legend became something else. An inheritance passed not through blood, but through memory. In 1992, nearly 30 years after Dallas, the United States Congress passed the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act. It ordered the release of thousands of documents related to the assassination. For a moment, there was hope. Answers, maybe. But many of the most sensitive files, including those involving the CIA, foreign governments, and certain surveillance operations, remained classified. Delays were granted. Deadlines moved. Even into the 2020s, some remained sealed. Why? What could still be so dangerous? The story of JFK became a mirror. In books, in movies, in music, in classrooms, in conspiracies. He was the young idealist, the tragic hero, the flawed genius, the victim of a state within a state, the man who might have saved the soul of America if only the bullets hadn't found him. Each generation remade him. Oliver Stone's JFK brought paranoia to the masses. Stephen King wrote 11/22/63, a time travel epic to save him. Every few years, a new theory. CIA, Mafia, Castro, anti-Castro, military-industrial complex, Lyndon Johnson, or all of them together, because one death could not possibly hold so many echoes. And yet it did, because it wasn't just a man who died in Dealey Plaza. It was a symbol of what might have been, of what never became. In the years after JFK's death, America fell into cycles of war, scandal, cynicism, and division. From Vietnam to Watergate, from Iran, Contra to Iraq, the ideals of Camelot, service, sacrifice, inspiration, felt more like poetry than policy. And today, the questions remain. Did something break in Dallas? Is that fracture still with us? When people talk about distrust in government, about deep state conspiracies, intelligence overreach, surveillance states, they're talking, knowingly or not, about the legacy of November 22, 1963. When a generation feels orphaned by truth, they trace it back to a motorcade. When we ask why hope feels fragile, why leaders seem smaller, why politics feels performative, we glimpse the ghost of a man who once said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." That line, still quoted, still romanticized, still misunderstood, was not a command. It was a riddle, a challenge wrapped in myth. And maybe that's why the myth won't die, because we don't want it to. We need it. Somewhere in a quiet bedroom, a child lies beneath a blanket. A flashlight clicks on. The book is old. The spine creaks. Profiles encourage. The voice is his father's, reading slowly, about men who stood up when it cost them everything. The last page turns. The light clicks off, and the father whispers, "Some people die, others are taken, but a myth walks forever." And in the dark, the myth walks on. At Arlington, the wind whispers. It moves through the rows of white stone like breath through a chapel. There is a grave, simple, unadorned, save for the flame. It flickers, not wildly, but steadily. No glass, no protection, just an open tongue of fire. The eternal flame. It was Jackie's idea. When the funeral ended and the crowds dispersed and the soldiers folded the flag, she stayed, and she whispered to an aide that her husband needed something more. Not just stone, not just marble, but light. A symbol not of death, but of endurance. They had stood together at a French memorial months earlier. She'd seen a flame like it at Napoleon's tomb, and now she wanted that same glow, defiant in the wind. And so it was built, quietly, quickly. A temporary torch first, then a permanent one. Day and night it burns, through snow and heat, through decades and doubt. It burned when Vietnam collapsed, when Nixon fell, when towers did too. It burned when a black man took the oath of office, when another Kennedy ran and lost. It burned as the Kennedy name receded from politics and rose in legend. It burned when the documents were delayed again, when conspiracies twisted tighter. It burned even as memory did not agree on what exactly it remembers. What is a flame, after all? A signal? A vigil? A prayer? A warning? Or is it a mirror? John Fitzgerald Kennedy was not a saint, not a god, not the flawless icon carved in bronze. He was sickly, reckless, charming, private, bold, conflicted. A man of war who dreamed of peace. A cold warrior who asked the Soviets to go to the moon, together. He failed often. Bay of Pigs, Vietnam escalation, broken promises. But he also gave something rare, a vision, not just for what America was, but for what it might be. A nation of courage, of service, of grace under pressure. His presidency lasted 1,036 days, not even 3 years, but myth needs only a moment. Camelot, Jackie later said, quoting the Broadway show, was never meant to last. Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment. The world remembered that moment, and in that remembering, it kept returning to him, to the cadence, the suits, the voice, the wit, the way he walked, the speeches, the flame. And so, we ask, where do myths go when there's no one left to carry them? Where does the flame flicker when the hands that lit it are dust? The answer is, here. Here, in memory. In stories whispered before bed. In textbooks, yes, but also in hearts. In a country that still yearns, not for perfection, but for meaning. For heroes who tried. For courage, even flawed. And so long as that yearning exists, the flame will not die. Because it isn't fed by gas. It is fed by us. It flickers in the voice of a teacher, explaining a speech. In a child under a blanket, tracing a name. In an old man who remembers the parade, the silence, the flags. It flickers in questions still asked, in truths not yet spoken, in courage not yet tested. It flickers in the dream of a nation, of a better self, of a myth. That myth walks forever, and at Arlington, the flame still burns.